Shakespeare and Tragedy in the Wasteland. For a poet principally celebrated for a work named after a barren landscape, T.S. Eliot had a remarkable fondness for waters of all kinds. Growing up in New England, he frequently visited the coast with his family and became a keen sailor. The influence of these experiences can be heard most distinctly in the first section of the Dry Salvages, in which water becomes protagonist. The sea howl and the sea yelp are different voices, often together heard. The whine in the rigging, the menace and caress of wave that breaks on water, the distant note in the granite teeth, and the wailing warning from the approaching headland are all sea voices. Earlier in the same section, Eliot acknowledges the personal aspect of this examination of the water voice. The strong brown god of the river is discerned through his rhythm in the nursery bedroom, and in other places deeply suggestive of childhood memory. One can be sure that this is Eliot recalling New England, but the detachment and clarity of the poetry allow us to feel this rhythm to be part of all human lives. Another childhood influence on Eliot was Shakespeare, whose works he knew extensively from an early age. Quite apart from the often controversial criticism, his poetry frequently alludes to Shakespeare, and in interesting ways. "No, I am not Prince Hamlet, nor was meant to be." These lines from the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, Eliot's first published work, already show his tendency to concern himself with situations that sidestep tragedy in Shakespearean versions. Prufrock is pathetic, but lacks the grandeur and hubris of a Hamlet. His tragedy lies in not being tragic enough. Almost, at times, the fool. The Wasteland, more than any other work of Eliot's, abounds with Shakespearean allusion. Yet for all the references therein to the tragedies, The Tempest is the play that is placed closest to the heart of the poem, a play that is not only not a tragedy, but which is also dominated by the sea. In a poem which is often interpreted as tragic, if not downright apocalyptic, this is a peculiar thing to find. Yet if we examine the matter more closely, we will find that it brings us close to the real concerns of the wasteland. But before focusing on the use of Shakespeare, it is worthwhile to glance at the purpose of quotations in the wasteland as a whole. Firstly, and most obviously, they act as a structuring device, giving the work most of its relatively scarce points of reference, both internally and within a wider cultural context. This is particularly relevant where the same work is cited, or even the same words quoted, more than once. For instance, "Those are pearls that were his eyes," which I shall discuss later. Secondly, the substance of the quotations reflects upon, and is reflected upon by, their contexts. These quotations deepen the events of the poem by linking them with literary equivalents, and are themselves changed by being put into an unfamiliar and unsettling context. Ezra Pound, when editing the poem, cut large chunks of Eliot's own verse, while leaving intact the most quotation-full sections, such as "What the Thunder Said." Pound, in the cantos, went on to take this method of literary historical patchwork much further, while Eliot developed in a wholly different direction. Let us look at a particular example of Eliot's borrowing to show how these two functions work in practice. In The Burial of the Dead, lines 34 to 41, the recollection of the Hyacinth Girl, are framed by two quotations from Tristan und Isolde. The first is a hopeful song, anticipating love, from the very first minutes of the opera, as Isolde is sailing to meet and marry King Mark. The second is from the opening of Act 3, as the dying Tristan waits for Isolde to come to him. But, as his servant reports, the sea is empty, i.e. of ships. For anyone familiar with Wagner's opera, this line is bound to conjure up the mood of extreme despair created in the first quarter hour of Act 3. In between these quotations, Eliot places what appears to be the fragmented recollection of a past failed love. Initially, and following straight on from the upbeat of Frisch weht der Wind, a mood of positive feelings, and perhaps sexual anticipation, is created by the girl's recollection of the gift of hyacinths. This is followed by a more intense mood of sexuality, so much so that it becomes sinister. Your arms full, and your hair wet. This is the most intense moment emotionally in the poem so far. Its collapse into mute despair prepares us, in little, for much of what is to follow. I could not speak, and my eyes failed. I was neither living nor dead, and I knew nothing. After that, Od und leer das Meer is as much a metaphor and an onomatopoeic reaction as it is a literary parallel. Looking at this example, we can see how carefully Eliot performed his literary graftings. These quotations do indeed provide the flesh of the poem with a cultural backbone, while also meshing very closely with the poetry, having implications for both. In this case, the use of Tristan reminds us of the traditional nature of the love-despair theme, even though Eliot's own treatment of it is unusual and highly ambiguous, and transfers responsibility for the failure of love from the sphere of fate to that of the psyche. It is also worth noting, for the thematic framework within the poem, that Tristan, like The Tempest, is a work dominated by the sea. I have already shown how the two quotations mirror the mood of the poetry that they frame, pinpointing its swift transformation from amorous excitement to despair. This is how the quotations serve their context. It is also true, however, that the context changes the quotations, for by bringing extracts from different ends of the opera into close proximity, the Tristan story, like the story of the Hyacinth Girl, becomes a highly compressed tumble from light to darkness. Such compression occurs frequently in The Wasteland, in which a quoted line may cause a whole work to flash before us in a single moment. It is this property of quotations, their ability to act as dense cells of association, that helps to create the kaleidoscopic effect of the poem. The poem is a protean spiral of ideas which, as in Piers Plowman, keep returning to the same place, if one that rarely looks the same. It is a poem of transformations. We have already seen how the story of Tristan is transformed into the reminiscence of the Hyacinth Girl, and then changed still further by its context and its links with the poem's key themes. This process happens time after time. To mention but a few of the more significant transformations, Mr. Eugenides, the Smyrna merchant, becomes Phlebas the Phoenician. Belladonna becomes the typist home at tea time, and Elizabeth I, amongst others. London becomes Dante's hell, then the constantly changing unreal city that is all cities, and so on. Eliot's use of Shakespeare is particularly interesting with regard to this cycle of transformations, not least because the plays are so well known. Shakespeare in The Wasteland, however, is significant for a better reason. It points us towards some kind of definition of tragedy in the poem, and the matter of whether the poem is tragic in any way at all. In A Game of Chess, we find the oft-quoted lines, "Oh, oh, 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 that Shakespearean rag, it's so elegant, so intelligent," which refer both to a popular song and to Othello's cry of horror when it is made clear to him that the newly murdered Desdemona is innocent. By means of such a juxtaposition, a tragic denouement is changed to a jingle. Othello's howls become a rhythmic chorus. The rhyme of elegant with intelligent increases the effect of witty pastiche. At the same time, the sense of the words is reminiscent of Portrait of a Lady. So intimate, this Chopin, that I think his soul should be resurrected only among friends. In both cases, great art has become a conversation piece, like Michelangelo in Prufrock, a social touchstone. The names of Shakespeare and Chopin are invoked like gods, yet there is no real evidence of understanding. The contexts of these quotations each portray a woman in need of affection, but unable to express this directly. These cultural references seem to be ways of trying to gain acceptance. Eliot emphasizes the point by further reference to Shakespeare. An atmosphere of Juliet's tomb is the setting for Portrait of a Lady. Laughter in the dark, one feels. A game of chess is introduced by the following lines. The chair she sat in, like a burnished throne, glowed on the marble. This is a cold and unsettling image, very far from the gorgeous splendor of the original lines from Antony and Cleopatra, on which it is based. Enobarbus's description of Cleopatra's barge, Act 2, Scene 2. The choice of play is deliberate. A tragedy of love becomes a tragedy of lovelessness. Eliot is not aiming to make a merely cultural complaint about the reduction of tragedy as a result of a reduction in people's ability to have tragic feelings. His is not such a simplistic view. The situations he describes in The Wasteland are just as tragic, if in a very different way, as their grander Shakespearean counterparts. The nervous questions of the woman in A Game of Chess are just as pitiful as Othello's inarticulate agony. Inability to feel is just as tragic as feeling too much. Indeed, loss of sensibility is the key to The Wasteland. It is no coincidence that A Game of Chess, which continues with the story of the sadly abused Lil, whose husband only wants a good time, closes with words spoken by the insane Ophelia shortly before her death. Ophelia is more significant than her brief presence here might suggest, as in Hamlet itself, her relative silence, until her madness, is most eloquent. Like Lil, she is a put-upon woman, the victim of callousness on the part of all the dominant men in Elsinore. For her, being the victim of want of sensibility leads to want of sense. This, Eliot suggests, is one way out of The Wasteland, a point emphasized by quotation from Shakespeare's near-contemporary Kyd at the very end of the poem. Why then I'll fit you, Hieronymo's mad again. Spanish Tragedy, Act 4, Scene 1. Madness becomes a liberator. It acts thus for Ophelia, whose insane pronouncements are a form of revenge, particularly on the absent Hamlet. In the case of Hieronymo, madness is a cover for revenge. Either way, it frees its victims from conformity, and hence from the social sterility that is at the cancerous heart of The Wasteland. And what becomes of Ophelia? Laertes. Too much of water hast thou, poor Ophelia, and therefore I forbid my tears. Act 4, Scene 7. She, like Phlebas, suffers death by water, and therefore provides a link with the latter part of the poem, in which water, both by its presence and its absence, becomes a controlling image, starting with the Thames at the beginning of the Fire Sermon, and going on through Death by Water, originally a lot longer and a lot more watery, to the metaphors of drought and monsoon in What the Thunder Said. Water becomes the main agent of transformation, the poem becoming the whirlpool in both shape and intent. The Tempest provides an important link in the chain of watery references because, in it, Shakespeare not only recognizes the ambiguity of water as friend and enemy, he also plays off comic and tragic elements against each other, as well as the elements in the other sense of the word. It is a play of transformations and reversals, and one which asks more questions than it appears to answer. In all these respects, it has a great deal in common with The Wasteland itself. Having come to The Tempest, it is worth reconsidering briefly Eliot's personal affinity feeling for water and ships, and how this is revealed in his poetry. I have already mentioned the dry salvages, and we can find a reference to the rocks of the title in the excise portion of Death by Water, reinforcing the New England connection. Closer in date and in mood to The Wasteland is Marina, written in 1931. Although linked with Shakespeare's Pericles in some way, the poem, one of Eliot's most beautiful and suggestive pieces, does no more than hint at the mood of the play. It is impossible, and indeed pointless, to attempt to link the plot of Pericles with the song-like sublimity of Marina, save that both works are dominated by the sea and by ships. It is not hard to see the similarity between Marina's relationship to Pericles and that of the wasteland to the Tempest. All four works have, as well as their watery association, a common reaching out beyond tragedy, to a state in which suffering becomes a path to something of great value. This becomes clearer if we look at what precisely Eliot took from The Tempest. The most significant quotation is that taken from Full Fathom 5. Those are pearls that were his eyes. Act 1, Scene 2. This occurs twice, firstly in the burial of the dead, in association with the drowned Phoenician sailor of Madame Sosostris's tarot pack, and hence with Death by Water. Its second appearance is in a game of chess, where it forms part of the conversation between the nervous woman and another unnamed voice. Here it is associated with the Shakespearean rag, possibly, in this context, a mocking reference to Ariel's songs, and with Rat's Alley, where the dead men lost their bone. This is obviously no coincidence, as the following lines from the fire sermon demonstrate. While I was fishing in the dull canal, musing upon the king my brother's wreck, and on the king my father's death before him, white bodies naked on the low damp ground, and bones cast in a little low dry garret, rattled by the rat's foot only, year to year. Again a reference to The Tempest, and more specifically to Ferdinand's mourning in Act 1, Scene 2, is juxtaposed with the sordid image of a charnel house. Yet not only is The Tempest not a tragedy, no one actually dies in it. By referring to Ferdinand's mistaken mourning, Eliot gives us something that is apparently tragic, yet brings with it the knowledge that the tragedy is false, and Ariel's song, grim though it may be, is mockery. The point is emphasized further. This music crept by me on the waters introduces the unexpectedly upbeat section of the fire sermon that follows the typist home at tea time episode. The context of the line is, yet again, Ferdinand's mistaken sorrow, but on its own it suggests no definite mood, and is used by Eliot to suggest a mood of rare optimism and a sense of beauty. Here, for all its alleged pessimism, we are beginning to get to the heart of the wasteland. It should now be clearer why "those are pearls that were his eyes" is one of the most significant lines in the whole poem. It encapsulates the sea change of Ariel's song, a kind of ironic resurrection, but a resurrection nonetheless. There are other strange resurrections in the wasteland. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land. That corpse you planted last year in your garden, has it begun to sprout? Will it bloom this year? These are certainly bizarre ways to invoke spring, but they do not negate the possibility of renewal. They turn it into something rich and strange and, above all, difficult. What Eliot is doing here, among other things, is to overturn a traditional positive view of spring, such as that which opens the Canterbury Tales and which is reworked in the poem's opening lines above, and replace it with an older concept of renewal as something to be striven for, something requiring sacrifice. Hence his reference, in his somewhat hindsighted notes, to Frazer's The Golden Bough as a primary source for the wasteland's framework. The poem's cyclical pattern reflects this theme of renewal through pain. Throughout, the modern characters of the wasteland itself are shown as loveless and stagnated. The other side of the coin is often violence and death. Hardly a welcome alternative, but Eliot suggests that an awareness of death creates an awareness of life, hence the sprouting corpse. On the other hand, we are not meant to see this dilemma as an exclusively modern problem. The episode of The Typist Home at Tea Time, the closest we come to social criticism, is interrupted by the deathless figure of Tiresias, who has forsuffered all, enacted on this same divan or bed. Rape is not new, as the recurring story of Philomel reminds us, nor is the kind of endured rape that women such as Lille and the typists suffer. It is wrong to see The Waste Land as a criticism of Eliot's own age. That is merely its starting point. The accumulating cultural references to other ages steadily deepen our awareness of an unresolved human flaw. They are certainly not meant to look back to anything better. When we are asked to consider Phlebas in Death by Water, we are not necessarily being called to mourning. Phlebas has been freed of the profit and loss, of the banality and materialism of quotidian existence. His death is not easy, but it is the ultimate transformation. And now, those are pearls that were his eyes. Sacrifice is enriching. After the soused, baptismal death by water, What the Thunder Said immediately presents us with the contrasting image of extreme drought, emotional as well as physical. The Easter vigil before the resurrection, the hallucinatory thirst in the dry mountains, and the expectation of thunder and rain from the Upanishad all use the basic metaphor of drought as illustration of Eliot's theme of self-privation. When the thunder comes, it brings with it the message of the waste land. Data, dayatvam, damyata. Give, sympathize, control. The awful daring of a moment's surrender leads to an understanding of others. The reference to Coriolanus again demonstrates that Shakespeare is Eliot's touchstone for tragedy. The message here is that the ability to sympathize with a tragic figure will lead to understanding and the ability to face suffering, and hence to control our own lives. Only through acceptance of the worst is renewal possible. This is, of course, a very brief summary of the last part of the poem, and the poet himself almost seems to shrink from this breakthrough in the fragmentary closing lines, presided over by the ever-waiting Fisher King, who is at the same time the solitary Ferdinand, stranded without revelation on Prospero's island. Nevertheless, the poem's message of isolation versus communication and self-denial is still clear. This is not tragic, but instead an offering of some hope, albeit from desperation. The Tempest, with its similar themes, is an ideal foil for Eliot's own ideas, particularly Full Fathom 5, which shows, in its depiction of a dead man becoming at one with the sea, the grimmer side of the redemption theme that occurs so often in The Waste Land. In Eliot's mind, this theme seems to have been linked very strongly with the sea, for he was still making the same associations when he wrote The Dry Salvages some 20 years later. O voyagers, O seamen, you who come to port, and you whose bodies will suffer the trial and judgment of the sea, or whatever event, this is your real destination. Not farewell, but fare forward, voyagers.